Hi, I'm Sara of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode in our History Bites series. Today, we will discuss the Watergate Scandal and the subsequent resignation of President Richard Nixon. The origins of the Watergate break-in lay in the hostile political climate of the time. By 1972, when Republican President Richard M. Nixon was running for re-election, the United States was embroiled in the Vietnam War, and the country was deeply divided. A forceful presidential campaign, therefore, seemed essential to the president and some of his key advisors. Their aggressive tactics included what turned out to be illegal espionage. In May of 1972, as evidence would later show, members of Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, known derisively as CREEP, broke into the Democratic National Committee's Watergate Hotel headquarters, stole copies of top-secret documents, and bugged the office's phones. The wiretaps failed to work properly, however, so on June 17th, a group of 5 burglars returned to the Watergate building. As the prowlers were preparing to break into the office with a new microphone, a security guard noticed someone had taped over several of the building's door locks. The guard called the police, who arrived just in time to catch them red-handed. It was not immediately clear that the burglars were connected to the president, though suspicions were raised when detectives found copies of the re-election committee's White House phone number among the burglars' belongings. 4 of them formerly had been active in the Central Intelligence Agency activities against Fidel Castro in Cuba. The 5th, James W. McCord Jr., was the security chief of the committee to re-elect the president, which was presided over by John Mitchell, Nixon's former attorney general. The arrest was reported in the next morning's Washington Post in an article written by Alfred E. Lewis, Carl Bernstein, and Bob Woodward. Throughout the 1972 campaign season, Woodward and Bernstein were fed leaks by an anonymous source they referred to as Deep Throat, who only some 30 years later was revealed to be FBI Deputy Director W. Mark Felt Sr. They kept up a steady stream of scoops demonstrating that 1. The direct involvement of Nixon intimates in Watergate activities, 2. That the Watergate wiretapping and break-in had been financed through illegally laundered campaign contributions, and 3. That the Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of President Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House, part of a basic strategy of the Nixon re-election effort. A handful of Nixon's aides, including White House counsel John Dean, testified before a grand jury about the president's crimes. They also testified that Nixon had secretly taped every conversation that took place in the Oval Office. If prosecutors could get their hands on those tapes, they would have proof of the president's guilt. Nixon struggled to protect the tapes during the summer and fall of '73. His lawyers argued that the president's executive privilege allowed him to keep the tapes to himself, but Judge Sara, the Senate committee, and an independent special prosecutor named Archibald Cox were all determined to obtain them. When Cox refused to stop demanding the tapes, Nixon ordered that he be fired, leading several Justice Department officials to resign in protest. These events, which took place on October 20th, 1973, are known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Eventually, Nixon agreed to surrender some, but not all, of the tapes. Early in 1974, the cover-up and efforts to impede the Watergate investigation began to unravel. On March 1st, a grand jury appointed by a new special prosecutor indicted 7 of Nixon's former aides on various charges related to the Watergate affair. The jury, unsure if they could indict a sitting president, called Nixon an unindicted co-conspirator. On July 24th, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Nixon must provide the recordings, and between July 27th and the 30th, the House Judiciary Committee passed 3 articles of impeachment, and then on August 5th, The president supplied transcripts of 3 tapes that clearly implicated him in the cover-up. With these revelations, Nixon's last support in Congress evaporated. He announced his resignation on August 8th, stating that he no longer had a strong enough political base with which to govern. Nixon left office at noon the following day, August 9th.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
On September 8th of 1974, the new president, Gerald Ford, chose to grant Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed while president. Ford had become vice president in December of 73, after Nixon's previous VP, Spiro T. Agnew, resigned amid accusations of financial improprieties and pled no contest to a single negotiated criminal charge. By the time of the pardon, enough Americans had become convinced that Nixon was guilty of crimes and that Ford had pardoned him as quid pro quo for becoming president that the approval rating of the otherwise popular new president collapsed overnight. Some of Nixon's aides were not so lucky. Nixon's Attorney General of the U.S., John Mitchell, served 19 months for his role in the scandal, while Watergate mastermind G. Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent, served 4.5 years. Nixon's Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, spent 19 months in prison, while John Ehrlichman spent 18 for attempting to cover up the break-in. Nixon himself never admitted to any criminal wrongdoing, though he did acknowledge using poor judgment. The Watergate scandal created an atmosphere of cynicism and distrust. While many Americans had been deeply dismayed by the outcome of the Vietnam War and saddened by the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and other leaders, Watergate added further disappointment to a national climate already soured by the difficulties and losses of the previous decade. For the rest of the decade, both popular and political culture were immersed with paranoia and disillusionment. Ronald Reagan's ascent to the presidency in 1980 had very much to do with his rhetorical ability to break the cloud of gloom that Watergate, along with the U.S. failure in the Vietnam War, had cast upon the country. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.